Imagine just the sheer panic in a political war room, right? A single two-word profanity-laced tweet from a commentator just completely outperforms the carefully crafted messaging of a sitting head of state.
Oh, yeah. Outperforms is almost putting it lightly. It utterly eclipsed it.
Right. And what's wild to me is that this tiny digital interaction might actually be, the very first visible domino in a massive chain reaction, a reaction that actually ends with a third of the world's global food supply being cut off.
I know, it sounds almost like a movie plot, but it is a staggering cascade of events. We are literally looking at a situation where local digital anger translates directly into global physical disruption.
Well, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are stepping into a geopolitical landscape today that is shifting so violently. Honestly, the traditional maps are practically useless at this point.
Yeah, you can throw the old playbooks right out the window.
Exactly. So we're unpacking a massive, really blistering conversation today between YouTube host Mario Nawfal and political commentator Anna Kasparian, and they just dive into everything. I mean, from the invisible architecture of your phone's apps to secretive maneuvers on the floor of the U.S. Congress.
Then all the way to commercial shipping bottlenecks in the Middle East.
Yes.
It is a huge, sprawling topic.
It really is. And because of the sheer scope and, frankly, the raw intensity of the geopolitical claims they make in this source, we need to set the stage carefully before we begin analyzing this material.
Yes, that is absolutely crucial today.
Right. So before we unpack this, we want to make it crystal clear to you, the listener.
Yeah.
We are strictly impartial guides here. We are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of the viewpoints, policies, or statements made by the individuals in our source material. Our only job today is to deconstruct what was said so you can understand the arguments being made.
Yeah, that's the perfect framing. Because what we're really going to do today is trace the anatomy of a global fracture. We'll start by examining how a single interaction on social media exposes the mechanics of, well, digital proxy wars, and really the failure of algorithmic censorship.
Which is fascinating on its own.
It is. And from there, we'll look at how that widespread digital frustration hits a brick wall in the U.S. legislative system. Specifically, we'll focus on some highly controversial defense provisions.
And then we go global.
Exactly. We move from the halls of Congress straight to the geopolitical chessboard. We'll be analyzing the incredibly tense dynamic right now between NATO, Turkey, and Russia.
Right, which forces the U.S. into a really tough spot.
An impossible position, really, regarding its alliance with Israel. We'll dissect the psychological and military doctrines currently driving Israeli internal politics, trace how those doctrines manifest on the ground in Gaza and Lebanon, and finally, look at how this localized resistance ideology triggers an undeclared war in the Strait of Hormuz.
A conflict that literally threatens the very core of the global economy.
Precisely.
Okay, so let's start at that very first domino. Because this sprawling, heavy conversation, it didn't start with, like, a think tank white paper.
No, not at all.
It started with a 4th of July post on X. So Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, puts out this standard, very polished post congratulating America on its Independence Day.
Standard diplomatic stuff.
Yeah, totally standard. But then Anna Kasparian responds with just 2 words. She literally just replies, "Fuck you," and the internet essentially breaks.
Yeah, and it's the mechanics of what happened next that are just so revealing. Because it's not actually about the profanity itself.
Right. It's the math.
Exactly, the underlying algorithmic math.
Yeah.
Kasparian's 2-word reply garnered roughly double the engagement of the original post from the Prime Minister.
Which is insane. I mean, in internet culture, we call that a ratio.
A massive ratio. And when a private citizen ratios a sitting head of state on a major geopolitical issue, it acts as a very quantifiable indicator of public sentiment.
Yeah, and Nawfal and Kasparian look at this and they conclude that Israel is suffering from just irreversible PR damage. But the really fascinating part of their discussion to me is how political leaders try to solve this. Because the instinct of the establishment, and we mean globally here, not just in Israel, their instinct is to try and fix this by playing with the digital plumbing.
Yes, the tech fixes.
Right. They think, if we just tweak the algorithm, or if we buy enough bot networks, or if we just outright ban the voices we don't like, we can just erase the sentiment.
Which is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the modern information ecosystem actually functions. You cannot simply memory hole a reality that people are actively observing with their own eyes.
It just doesn't work anymore.
It really doesn't. Engaging in that kind of censorious behavior, it doesn't silence the dissent at all. It amplifies it. It's basically the Streisand effect applied to a global conflict.
Wow, yeah, the Streisand effect.
Right, because the very act of trying to suppress the information actually validates the idea that the information is incredibly important and that it's dangerous to the establishment.
Okay, and Kasparian uses a highly controversial figure to prove the mechanics of this, right? She brings up Nick Fuentes.
She does.
Now, putting his actual ideology completely aside, because that's not what they're focusing on, she looks at him as a structural case study in censorship. He was banned from YouTube, Twitter, virtually every mainstream platform you can think of.
Completely deplatformed.
Right. But he didn't vanish. He just migrated to alternative platforms like Rumble, and his audience didn't just follow him, it multiplied.
Because the ban itself became his primary marketing tool.
Exactly.
Kasparian points out that when you ban someone, especially in the eyes of young men who are kind of looking for counterculture anyway, you turn that person into forbidden fruit.
Yeah, it's edgy now.
Exactly. The mainstream rejection becomes a badge of authenticity. So the establishment basically handed him a massive megaphone by trying to take his microphone away.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I have to jump in here with an analogy. It's like trying to hold a beach ball under the water.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. The harder you push it down with censorship, the more violently it just pops up somewhere else. But I do want to push back slightly on Kasparian here,
Go ahead.
because she makes a leap that feels, honestly, incredibly optimistic to me. She claims that young people are just too savvy to be manipulated by these algorithms, that they will always hunt down the truth.
She does say that, yeah.
But, I mean, algorithms aren't just like a poster on a wall you can walk past. They literally dictate the entire architecture of the internet you experience. So, are people really savvy enough to outsmart systems built by thousands of the smartest engineers on the planet? Systems designed specifically to hijack human psychology.
That is a brilliant distinction, and the conversation actually wrestles with this exact paradox.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, because even while Kasparian argues people will seek out banned content, she simultaneously critiques the terrifying power of those very recommendation engines.
Okay, how so?
Well, she explains how the YouTube algorithm, for example, brutally punishes creators who try to shift their subject matter.
Oh, right, the pivot penalty.
Exactly. If your audience is built on, say, foreign policy outrage, and you try to post a nuanced, calm video about local zoning laws, the algorithm just throttles your reach. It refuses to serve that content because it doesn't match the established engagement profile it built for you.
So the system basically forces you to become a caricature of yourself.
Precisely. The algorithmic infrastructure demands that creators feed their audience the exact same emotional triggers over and over again just to survive financially.
Wow.
So it traps users in echo chambers. And not necessarily out of some grand political conspiracy, but simply because familiar outrage is the most reliable metric for keeping people on the site.
Right, retention.
Yes. So while a user might be savvy enough to find alternative platforms like Rumble, they're still fundamentally trapped in an invisible cage that optimizes for extreme entrenched thought.
Which just creates an absolute pressure cooker.
It really does.
Because if you're a regular citizen, you're trapped in this algorithmic loop of highly emotionally charged information all day. You form a very strong opinion about what is happening in the world. Mm-hmm. But then you look up at your political leaders, and they are acting as if none of this information even exists. They are completely ignoring the sentiment of the public.
And that chasm, that disconnect between the governed and the governing, that is the next major theme they explore.
It's a huge theme.
To illustrate just how wide that gap has become, Kasparian brings up a statistic that genuinely shocked Mario Naufel. She cites a recent APNORC poll claiming that 30% of American Jews now state that Israel has carried out a genocide in Gaza.
Wait, really? 30%?
30%.
I mean, that isn't a fringe element. That is a massive demographic shift within a community that historically has had a much more uniformly supportive view of Israeli state policy.
Exactly. When nearly a third of a core demographic signals a complete departure from the establishment narrative, that indicates a deep structural fracture.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the political leadership just continues to operate on the assumption that it's still the 1990s. They are pursuing foreign policies that are diametrically opposed to the shifting will of massive swaths of their populace.
And Kasparian points out that this isn't happening in a vacuum, right? It's happening while everyday people literally can't afford groceries. She calls it a dangerous cocktail.
A very volatile mix.
Yeah, because you have a global economy that is stuttering, largely exacerbated by these kinetic conflicts disrupting supply chains. So regular citizens are feeling intense economic pain.
Very real pain.
And while they are struggling, they log onto their phones and they see Elon Musk becoming a trillionaire. They see extreme wealth concentration at the exact same moment their tax dollars are funding foreign conflicts that they actively oppose.
And historically speaking, that specific combination, domestic economic hardship, paired with wildly unpopular foreign military expenditures and visible elite enrichment, that is the primary catalyst for severe civil unrest.
I mean, it's a recipe for a revolution.
Right. Kasparian warns that when governments prioritize foreign defense contracts and billionaire tax policies over the basic survival of the middle class, the public eventually turns its ire inward. They start looking at their own leaders.
And there's a sociological tipping point they discuss here that I think is just absolutely fascinating. Knopfel talks about the difference between a society where everyone secretly hates the current system and a society that has crossed the chasm where everyone knows that everyone else hates the system too.
Yes, that's a crucial concept. In game theory and sociology, that's known as the shift from mutual knowledge to common knowledge.
Okay, break that down for us.
Imagine a totalitarian regime. Everyone might individually hate the dictator, right? But because they think they are alone in that feeling, they stay silent out of fear.
Right, because nobody wants to be the first one to speak up and get arrested.
Exactly. That's mutual knowledge. Everyone knows it independently. But the moment someone stands up the town square and shouts it, and everyone looks around and sees that everyone else is nodding, that's common knowledge.
Ah, I see.
The illusion of consensus completely shatters. The establishment loses its primary weapon, which is the perception of inevitability. And Knopfel is arguing that the internet has rapidly accelerated our transition into common knowledge regarding the failure of these political systems.
Okay, so if you're listening to this, the obvious question you have to be asking is, if the politicians can see this poll data and they know the public is furious, why don't they just change their policies to win votes?
Right, that's the logical step.
Because that's how democracy is supposed to work. But Kasparian shuts that down with a level of cynicism that is, honestly, quite jarring. She argues the system doesn't adapt because it's actively designed to incentivize the most corrupt people possible to run for office.
Yes, her argument rests on the idea that public service has been entirely replaced by self-enrichment.
Yeah.
She points to the rampant, perfectly legal insider trading that happens within Congress. And she specifically highlights Donald Trump, alleging that his family utilized the presidency to generate billions in foreign deals and crypto schemes.
It's just wild.
Her point is deeply structural. If holding office allows you to generate immense personal wealth, regardless of your approval rating, then the traditional democratic mechanism of accountability, the fear of losing an election, is completely neutralized.
It really forces you to ask, whether the system is just temporarily broken or if this total insulation from public opinion is actually a feature, not a bug.
That is the big question.
Because if the public is this vehemently opposed to certain actions, how are politicians actually passing these controversial laws?
Yeah.
How do they get the funding through without mass protests just stopping them at the Capitol steps?
And that brings us to the dark arts of the legislative process.
Exactly. This is where it gets really interesting because the conversation gets incredibly specific about the mechanisms of power in Washington. Kasparian and Knopfel focus their outrage on something called Section 219 of the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA.
Right, the NDAA.
Let's pause and define the NDAA for a second because it's crucial for you to understand why this matters. The NDAA isn't just any bill. It's the massive annual legislation that funds the entire United States military.
It's the lifeblood of the Defense Department.
Yeah, it pays the soldiers, it buys the bullets. In Washington, it's what they call a must-pass bill. You literally cannot vote against the NDAA without your political opponent running a massive attack ad saying you voted to defund the troops.
Exactly. And because it is a must-pass bill, it becomes a magnet for incredibly controversial provisions that could never, ever pass on their own merit.
Right.
And according to the discussion, Section 219 is exactly one of those provisions. They claim this section literally merges the United States military with the Israel Defense Forces.
Wow.
They also bring up a parallel proposal by Senator Tom Cotton that would allegedly seek to merge the CIA with Mossad, creating this permanent, irreversible intelligence apparatus.
Okay, here's where I need to inject a little reality check because we need to weigh the rhetoric here. When they use the word merge, we have to parse what that actually means.
Right. The language is very strong.
Are we talking about a literal fusion where an American general is suddenly taking direct orders from an Israeli commander or vice versa? Or is this highly charged language being used to describe deeply entrenched interoperability, shared funding, and integrated technology?
It's almost certainly the latter. We're talking about a massive expansion of joint operations, shared intelligence databases, deeply intertwined defense contracting.
Right, not a literal new joint military brand.
No. However, Kasparian's larger point is that even deeply entrenched interoperability represents a surrender of sovereign foreign policy.
Right, that's an interesting way to put it.
Right. If your intelligence networks and your military logistics are that heavily integrated with another nation's, you fundamentally lose the ability to independently dictate your own regional strategy. The lines just blur entirely.
And the perception of this merger alone is enough to just inflame constituents. But the way this gets passed behind closed doors is just infuriating. Kasparian explains these bureaucratic choke points. She talks about the House Armed Services Committee basically acting as a gatekeeper.
Yes, the gatekeeper role is vital to understand here. So say a regular representative reads Section 219 and says, this is crazy, I want to introduce an amendment to strip this out.
Which is their job.
Right. But they don't just get to walk onto the House floor and demand a vote.
Yeah.
The amendment has to go through the committee first. And the committee, which is controlled by establishment leadership, simply refuses to let the amendment advance. They just kill it in the dark.
Wow.
Kasparian argues that these rules, along with things like the Senate parliamentarian and the legislative filibuster, these are not noble historical traditions of debate. They are tools designed explicitly to prevent politicians from ever having to go on the record and cast a vote on highly controversial, unpopular items.
It's all about avoiding accountability. And even if a watchdog group catches it, they specifically mention the Quincy Institute, which is a think tank in D.C. that advocates for military restraint. Even if they read the thousands of pages, find the provision, and sound the alarm, it honestly doesn't matter.
No, because the news cycle moves too fast.
Exactly. Nawfal points out that the modern news cycle is essentially a weapon of mass distraction. You get 24 hours of outrage about Section 219, and then suddenly the media pivots to a potential kinetic war with Iran or some new domestic scandal.
Right.
And the defense bill just quietly passes while everyone is looking the other way.
It highlights a profound vulnerability in democratic oversight. The sheer velocity of information acts as a shield for bureaucratic entrenchment.
But here's where the story pivots from domestic Washington politics to global grain strategy. Because you have this quiet, determined effort in Congress to permanently bind the U.S. and Israeli militaries together, happening at the exact same moment that global alliances are violently shifting in ways that put the U.S. and Israel fundamentally at odds.
A huge contradiction.
Yeah. We have to talk about the Turkey, Russia, and NATO triangle.
This is one of the most critical geopolitical flashpoints right now. The source zeroes in on a recent move by Donald Trump. He travels to Turkey and openly discusses approving the sale of advanced F-35 fighter jets to them.
Which is a huge deal.
Massive, because to do that, it would require lifting existing Gaza sanctions.
And we need to explain CAATSA because it's not just alphabet soup. CAATSA stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act.
Right.
Years ago, Turkey decided to buy the S-400 anti-aircraft missile system from Russia, and the U.S. explicitly told them, you cannot plug a highly advanced Russian radar system into the same network as our stealth F-35s.
Because the Russians would learn exactly how to track our planes.
Exactly. It's a massive security risk. But Turkey bought the Russian system anyway, so the U.S. slapped them with CAATSA sanctions and kicked them out of the F-35 program entirely.
Which was a massive geopolitical rupture within NATO at the time. So for Trump to now suggest lifting those sanctions and handing Turkey the crown jewel of American air superiority is a seismic shift.
It really is.
And, as the source points out, Israel views this as an absolute nightmare scenario.
Yeah.
Israeli leadership, including figures like Bezalel Smotrich and Netanyahu, they do not view Turkey merely as a diplomatic rival.
No, not at all.
They view Turkey as an active threat. The source claims Israeli leaders are openly telling their public to prepare for a literal kinetic war with Turkey.
So think about this. Trump is praising Erdogan and offering him stealth fighters, while Netanyahu is preparing his country for a war against him.
It's dizzying.
Knopfel and Kasparian try to make sense of this contradiction, and they present two distinct theories for why Trump is doing this. Let's start with Theory A.
So Theory A is rooted in Kasparian's cynicism about personal corruption. She hypothesizes that Trump's motivation is purely transactional and self-serving. She suspects there is a real estate deal, a corporate arrangement, or some form of personal financial enrichment at play between Trump and Erdogan. In her view, Trump would easily discard Israeli security concerns if it meant a lucrative payout for his own family business.
Right, so that's the transactional view. But Theory B is the geopolitical grand strategy view, and frankly, if you look at a map, it makes a lot more sense.
It does. Theory B posits that NATO and the broader Western security apparatus is quietly but urgently preparing for a massive direct confrontation with Russia.
Wow.
And if you were drawing up war plans against Moscow, Turkey is indispensable.
Why is that?
Well, Turkey possesses the second largest standing military in NATO, behind only the United States. Furthermore, they control the Bosporus Strait. That is the only maritime gateway into and out of the Black Sea, which is Russia's crucial naval theater.
Right, geography is destiny here.
Exactly. You simply cannot effectively contain or confront Russia without Turkey acting as the geographic and military linchpin.
So, imagine being a U.S. strategist sitting at a desk in the Pentagon right now. You have your traditional ally, Israel, demanding that you isolate, sanction, and weaken Turkey in order to preserve the balance of power in the Middle East. Israel wants to remain the uncontested military hegemon in that specific region. But your European allies and your own military planners are screaming that Turkey is the only thing standing between them and Russian aggression. It's a complete catch-22.
It is an intractable dilemma. You cannot simultaneously arm Turkey to serve as a bulwark against Russia while disarming them to placate Israel. It is a zero-sum game.
Right.
And Kasparian levels a very harsh critique here. She points out that Israel is a small nation with very limited natural resources, relying heavily on the United States for its defense infrastructure. Most notably, of course, the funding of the Iron Dome.
Yeah.
She argues that the U.S. is inevitably going to have to choose between catering to Israel's regional dominance and securing NATO's global strategic footing against Russia.
And to understand why Israel is pushing back so aggressively, why they are willing to alienate the United States over Turkey, a country they don't even share a border with, we have to look inward at the psychological and political climate inside Israel. The source provides a very vivid look at this internal bubble.
Yes, and Kasparian makes a crucial distinction here between the Israeli populace and their political leadership.
Important distinction.
She observes that the Israeli public is trapped in a relentless 24-hour news cycle that is intentionally designed to terrify them. They are immersed in a media environment that constantly reinforces the narrative that the entire world hates them and is actively plotting their destruction.
And look, when you live in a pressure cooker like that, your entire worldview alters. If you genuinely believe your family is facing imminent annihilation every time you step outside, you don't vote for moderate diplomats. You vote for the most aggressive, extreme figures available because they promise strength.
Exactly. And that explains the massive popularity of politicians like Itamar Ben-Gvir. This environment of perpetual terror creates the domestic mandate for the expansive military strategies we see playing out.
Right.
And the source highlights a fascinating, very real fracture within the Israeli military establishment regarding doctrine. You have Prime Minister Netanyahu pursuing what looks like an unbounded multi-front war.
He's everywhere right now.
He is simultaneously engaging Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, exchanging strikes with Iran, and rhetorically preparing for Turkey.
It's just a strategy of perpetual escalation, but not everyone in Israel agrees with that, right?
Far from it.
Yeah.
The source quotes Naftali Bennett, who, it should be noted, is historically known as a staunch hawk.
Right, he's not a duck.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But he is expressing deep concern. Bennett recognizes the shifting political winds in the United States and understands the existential danger of alienating their primary financial and military benefactor.
Yeah, you can't bite the hand that feeds you the Iron Dome.
Exactly. But the most stark contrast comes from Gadi Eisenkot, a former chief of staff of the IDF. His military doctrine is highlighted in the text, and it's rooted in cold geographic reality.
Okay, what's his approach?
He constantly reminds the public that Israel is a small country, not a global superpower. He advocates for clearly defined, objective-focused operations. Get in, achieve the strategic goal, and get out, rather than getting bogged down in protracted, unwinnable wars of attrition across multiple borders.
So why does Netanyahu's expansive approach win out over Eisenkot's measured realism? Kasparian argues it comes down to a fundamental distortion of consequence. She points directly to the Iron Dome.
This is a vital piece of game theoretic analysis. For every other nation on the planet, the decision to launch an invasion or a preemptive strike is heavily weighed against the fear of blowback.
Right, deterrence.
Yes. You hesitate to bomb a neighbor because you fear their missiles will inevitably rain down on your own cities. But the Iron Dome, which is subsidized heavily by American taxpayers, artificially removes that fear from the equation. Kasparian argues that by shielding the Israeli populace from the immediate physical consequences of their government's aggressive foreign policy, it allows the leadership to act with near total impunity.
So the technological shield essentially removes the political restraint. And it leads to this incredible cognitive dissonance in their political messaging. Let me give you an analogy here.
Go for it.
You see Israeli politicians standing at podiums declaring that they have absolutely no choice but to launch military incursions into southern Lebanon to clear out Hezbollah and create a sterile security buffer zone to protect their northern citizens.
Which sounds like a standard defensive military doctrine.
Right, it does. But out of the other side of their mouths, those exact same political factions are holding conferences openly discussing plans to build civilian settlements in that exact same territory in southern Lebanon. You can't have it both ways. If it's a dangerous buffer zone meant to absorb rocket fire, you don't move families and build schools there.
Sure.
So what does this all mean? Is it a shield or is it a land grab?
The moment you introduce civilian settlements into a buffer zone, it ceases to be a buffer zone. It becomes sovereign territory that requires even more military deployment to defend, which invariably pushes the required buffer even further out into neighboring land.
It's an endless cycle.
The source views this contradiction as proof that the true motive is an expansionist ideology masquerading as defensive necessity.
And this transition from a defensive posture to an expansionist reality brings us to the devastating on-the-ground consequences detailed in the source. Because an expansionist ideology guarantees a localized cycle of violence.
The physical realities described in the text are just grim. The source touches on Lebanon, noting that the IDF operations are not limited to surgical strikes against military infrastructure.
Oh.
They describe entire civilian villages being systematically leveled by bulldozers, rendering the land uninhabitable and leaving roughly 20% of the Lebanese population internally displaced.
20% unable to return to what was once their home. But the moment in the conversation that completely stops you in your tracks happened in Gaza. Mario Nawfal tells the story of a man named Mohammed al-Wahidi.
It's a heartbreaking story.
It really is. Al-Wahidi was the director of the Egyptian Committee in Gaza. His entire job, day in and day out, was trying to manage the logistics of survival for his community, finding food, securing shelter, trying to maintain some semblance of humanitarian aid amidst total destruction.
And in the middle of this grinding, relentless war, he decided to organize something purely for morale.
Yes. He set up giant projector screens in the Sabra neighborhood of Gaza City. He wanted families who were literally living in the rubble of their destroyed homes to just have 2 hours of normalcy. He organized a viewing party for the World Cup so the community could gather and watch Egypt play Argentina.
It's just a moment of joy.
Exactly, just a moment. But before the match even started, an Israeli airstrike hit a car nearby. Mohammed al-Wahidi was killed instantly. His driver was killed. And 2 young brothers, aged 8 and 10, were killed.
It is a profoundly tragic story. And the source breaks down the terrifying dissonance in how it was justified. The official IDF explanation was that al-Wahidi and the children were not the intended targets. They stated they were aiming for a suspected Hamas militant operating in the vicinity of the screening.
But Kasparian utterly rejects that framing. She argues that the collateral damage isn't accidental, it's the point.
That's a heavy claim.
It is. She states that the true crime, in the eyes of the operators calling in that strike, was the act of providing a modicum of joy to a Palestinian population that has been stripped of everything. She argues this reveals an ideology of total dehumanization.
And this story anchors her central thesis on the nature of what she terms resistance ideology.
Right.
She forcefully argues that you cannot solve this conflict purely through kinetic military force.
Right.
You cannot simply bomb Hamas or Hezbollah into non-existence because those organizations are not just static militias. They are the physical manifestation of resistance to displacement, occupation, and aggressive expansion.
It's physics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction.
Exactly. She points to the historical formation of Hezbollah. They didn't spontaneously generate in a vacuum. They formed in the early 1980s with the explicit, singular goal of ending what eventually became an 18-year Israeli military occupation of southern Lebanon.
Right.
Her argument is that as long as the catalyst exists, the bulldozing of villages, the civilian casualties, the settlement expansion, the ideology of resistance will regenerate. By engaging in these tactics, you are fundamentally acting as the most effective recruiting mechanism for the very groups you claim you want to destroy.
She gives a visceral analogy to make this hit home for an American audience. She says, if Mexico came in and tried to expand their borders into Southern California with the backing of a corrupt, foreign-funded government, you'd better believe Americans would form militias to resist.
It's basic human nature.
You defend the land you live on. And if we connect this to the broader strategic picture, acknowledging that human reality completely breaks the current military paradigm. If violence mathematically guarantees future resistance, then a purely military solution is a delusion. It's just a conveyor belt of endless tragedy.
It is a devastating localized tragedy.
Yeah.
But the crucial pivot the source makes is demonstrating that in the 21st century, local tragedies do not stay local.
They ripple out.
The ideological friction in Gaza and Lebanon has generated shockwaves that are currently threatening the entire global economic architecture. And this brings us to the final, incredibly tense segment of our deep dive, the Strait of Hormuz.
Right, because according to Kasparian, the United States is currently at war with Iran. She is furious that the media and politicians refuse to use the actual word, preferring terms like proportional responses or kinetic skirmishes.
The euphemisms are everywhere.
She says, very bluntly, we're bombing the hell out of their country, and they're retaliating by bombing U.S. military bases. We are at war. No, wait, what sparked this specific undeclared war?
The source identifies the specific action that escalated this from a proxy conflict to direct confrontation. They discuss a deliberate, provocative move by the United States, where the U.S. military actively encouraged commercial shipping vessels to travel exclusively through the Omani side of the Strait of Hormuz.
Attempting to bypass Iranian territorial waters entirely.
Exactly. Iran interpreted this as a direct challenge to their regional sovereignty and responded by flexing their naval capabilities, potentially moving to exert total control over the strait.
And if you aren't familiar with maritime geography, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most vital, vulnerable choke points on Earth. It's a tiny sliver of water between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. If you close it, you effectively pinch off the world's economic windpipe.
And the source points out how wildly the U.S. military aims had to adjust when they realized the physical reality of fighting in that strait.
What were the original aims?
Well, initially, Kasparian notes the U.S. demands were maximalist. They wanted the complete unconditional surrender of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
Which she laughs at, right?
She literally laughs at that demand in the text. It's absurd. Now, reality has set in, and the war aim has shifted to just a desperate attempt to regain enough basic security to convince insurance companies to let cargo ships pass through again.
Because the mechanics of global trade are incredibly fragile. It's not just about military ships, it's about marine insurance. The moment an area becomes an active war zone, insurance premiums for commercial freighters skyrocket to the point where it becomes economically unviable to sail.
Exactly. When shipping halts in Hormuz, the global fallout is immediate and severe.
The source outlines 3 massive crises triggered by this bottleneck. First, oil. The conflict is forcing the U.S. government to rapidly deplete the strategic petroleum reserve.
Which is supposed to be for absolute emergencies.
Right. They are draining emergency domestic stockpiles just to artificially suppress the price of gas at the pump and hide the economic shock from the American voter.
And the second crisis is significantly more alarming. It's the impact on global agriculture. The source highlights that roughly a third of the world's fertilizer supply relies on passage through the Strait of Hormuz.
A third?
Yes. Modern agriculture is entirely dependent on complex supply chains of nitrogen and natural gas derivatives. If that fertilizer stops flowing, it's not just an economic inconvenience. Crop yields in developing nations will plummet. Food prices will skyrocket globally, and you are looking at the mathematical certainty of famine.
A geopolitical spat over a waterway turning into empty grocery shelves worldwide. And the third crisis is the political trap it creates for Donald Trump. He is overseeing this undeclared war, but he is terrified of the political optics.
He is.
He reportedly told insiders that he absolutely refuses to officially declare it a war because he doesn't want to be remembered as the next Herbert Hoover, the president who presided over the onset of the Great Depression. He knows that an official war declaration would tank the markets.
So he attempts to manage it quietly. But the source openly mocks his grasp of the situation. They reference instances where he appears completely out of his depth, making impulsive decisions and even suffering embarrassing rhetorical gaffes.
Oh, right, like confusing allies and adversaries by referring to the Islamic Republic of Japan.
Exactly.
It is the ultimate bitter irony. Donald Trump's entire political persona is built on the mythos of being the ultimate dealmaker. Yet he finds himself trapped in a kinetic, escalating conflict where military force is utterly failing to secure a victory.
And the source makes it clear that the only actual off-ramp, the only way to reopen the strait and save the global supply chains from freezing, is a diplomatic deal with Iran.
But his political pride, or perhaps just a lack of strategic vision, prevents him from taking it. He is a deal-maker paralyzed by a war he refuses to acknowledge.
It is a stunning display of strategic paralysis.
Okay.
And it serves as the perfect, terrifying conclusion to the chain reaction we've been tracking.
Let's pull all of this together because the sheer scale of the interconnectedness we've explored today is just breathtaking.
It really is. We started by looking at a single profane tweet from a commentator outperforming a head of state, a data point, revealing a massive, boiling undercurrent of public anger.
Yeah.
We saw how that anger hits a dead end in a U.S. political system that feels designed to ignore it, allowing massive sovereign-altering decisions, like the deep integration of the U.S. and Israeli militaries, to hide behind bureaucratic committee rules.
We watched those hidden domestic maneuvers violently collide with global reality, where the U.S. is caught in an impossible tug-of-war, forced to choose between Israel's desire to isolate Turkey and NATO's desperate need for Turkey to block Russia.
And we looked deeply into the psychology of a terrified Israeli populace, contrasting their leaders' expansive multi-front war goals with the reality of an Iron Dome that artificially subsidizes the risk of conflict.
We examine the devastating human cost of that risk-free aggression, where simply providing a moment of joy with a World Cup viewing party ends in a lethal airstrike.
And we traced how the ideology driving those airstrikes structurally guarantees the creation of new resistance. A resistance that doesn't just stay in Gaza or Lebanon, but spills out into the oceans, triggering an undeclared war in the Strait of Hormuz.
A war that depletes oil reserves, halts the global fertilizer supply, and threatens to starve the very same American voter who sent that angry tweet in the first place.
It shows how profoundly intertwined digital sentiment, localized tragedy, and physical global supply chains truly are. You cannot isolate one variable without affecting the entire system.
It's a perfect, terrifying circle. We've covered an immense amount of ground today, but as we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought to process. We spent a lot of time today dissecting the fear of blowback. We talked about how a technological marvel like the Iron Dome might artificially remove that fear for a nation-state, and how sudden, crushing economic inflation might suddenly create that fear for politicians trying to cling to power. But think about this in an age where every localized conflict immediately disrupts the fragile global supply chains we rely on to survive, and where the visceral, bloody tragedy of those conflicts is instantly broadcast to billions of smartphones in high definition. Bypassing all state censors is blowback, even a localized concept anymore.
Wow.
Or have we crossed a threshold into an era where every single political action, every broken treaty, every dropped bomb instantly creates a reaction everywhere all at once?
It is a profound question, and it strongly suggests that the old, isolated rules of geopolitics simply do not exist anymore.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. It was a dense, heavy journey, but understanding the mechanics of these shifts is more important now than ever. We'll catch you on the next one. Take care.
Goodbye, everyone.